I'm Dave Rubin, and joining me today is a journalist who I don't have to use air quotes for, a New York Times best-selling author and author of the new book, Bad Therapy, Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up, Abigail Shrier from Los Angeles, dare I say it. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing great. How are you, Dave?
I'm doing just fine. It's good to see. We were compatriots in LA. I left you there, as I've left many of my former guests. But you're fighting the good fight, aren't you?
I am. I'm doing my best. But there's a good group of us out here, so we take care of each other.
So I'm super interested in talking about this book, actually, because one of the driving points of the book is not to sort of mock the young people, which is very easy for us to do. It's very easy for us to say, oh, they have purple hair and they're constantly screaming and all of that stuff. And I'm not saying I'm not above it, because I hit some of the low-hanging fruit sometime. But the real purpose of the book is to show that there's an entire industry that is in many ways designed and set up to kind of make them anxious and upset and angry and miserable. Was there a fair recap?
That was, and I appreciate that you said that, because I worked very hard to take seriously. I began from a point of taking seriously their pain. There's a generation, a lot of people look at them and say, oh, they have no reason to be upset. And they've lived through no World War, no Great Depression. Why should they be so bummed out? But we have a generation that is lonelier, sadder, more depressed, more anxious than anyone we've ever seen. And interestingly, they've also gotten the most mental health resources. They've had the most therapy of any generation. Nearly 42% have been in therapy. Huge numbers are on psychiatric drugs. And the question is then, why aren't they the picture of mental health? Instead, they're the picture of despair.
So I want to get into the flaws in therapy, which you talk about, and the flaws in the drugs and a few other things. But let's go to the one that I think most people can most obviously point to, which is social media. Because you and I are Gen Xers. We grew up in a time when we did not have that stuff. I don't hate technology. I'm not anti-technology. But we all know that technology is doing something to young people that seemingly was an unintended consequence. Perhaps it was intended by some people. But what do you make about that first? That they're all walking around with the world in their pocket and the connectivity in their pocket, and yet feel alone. I mean, it feels like an oxymoron to some degree.
That's right. I mean, let me just say, the social media isn't good. It's bad. We all know it. We've known it for the last 8 years. I don't think there's a parent in existence that doesn't know that social media is bad for kids. But do the smartphones explain the whole story? And I think the answer to that is certainly not. There are 4 reasons that smartphones don't completely explain what's wrong with this generation, why they're suffering, and why they don't want to grow up. The first is that adolescent and mental health has been in steady decline since the 1950s. Okay, this is not a news story. Second, small kids, and this is really important, kids aged 2 to 8, okay? These kids don't have smartphones. As of 2016, 1 in 6 had a mental health diagnosis. Now, they don't have smartphones now, but they certainly didn't have them in 2016. So why did 1 in 6 of them have a mental health diagnosis? There are 2 other reasons. Teen boys, this is a new finding this year, out from Jean Twenge, teen boys from liberal families suffer more, they're in worse distress than conservative girls. What that says to me is that this is environmental. It has something to do with the way the kids getting raised. These teen boys they're not on social media more than the girls from conservative families. We know that girls are on way more social media than boys. But somehow teen boys are in more distress if they come from liberal families. And then the fourth thing we know is that in countries like Japan and Israel, where cell phone use, smartphone use is just as prevalent, and even more prevalent in the case of Israel among teens, mental health is much better. So we know that other countries are doing something we're not, or maybe we're doing something we shouldn't be.
All right, so let's go backwards there. So in the case of Japan and China, I think probably just hearing those two, people can deduce certain things about culture. But is it as simple as that? A culture, a society with the sort of, I don't want to quite say uniculture, but something like that, is just able to deal with the madness of social media more easily?
Well, let me tell you, I really looked at countries like Japan, Israel, and Russia with the help of a cultural psychologist who I talk about in my book, Yulia Chantsova-Dutton. And one of the things she told me is that kids need independence. Kids need autonomy. That means taking risks that involve danger and paying the consequences to some extent. And I'm not talking about running into traffic or anything terribly, playing with drugs, or giving them those things, God forbid. But I'm saying a certain amount of risk and danger and independence, we've taken that away from kids, but they need it and they thrive with it. There are two other things that kids really need that they have lost in America. Okay. Parental authority. This is something we've exercised with kids truly since the beginning of human history. We've known that parents need, that kids do best when parents are in charge, which doesn't mean unloving parents, but loving and rule-based parents, so-called authoritative parents, have produced the happiest kids, the most successful kids, and the most mentally well kids. And we've known this now for generations. This is one of the most stable psychological findings we have. And then the third things kids need that they're not getting is stable relationships, stable, loving relationships over time. We have replaced grandparents, cousins, siblings in this country, the neighborhood kids, with friends parents have selected, and a series of adults who oversee the kids' every activity. That's just not the kind of thing that promotes healthy, attitudes and habits and feeling of well-being over a lifetime.
Do you find it weird, or I guess did you find it weird when you were writing the book, that sort of nothing you've said to me so far, it's not mind-blowing, right? Like these are things that we all sort of intuitively know. You're obviously getting the research and talking to people on the ground about these things. But like we all know these things one way or another, have the nuclear family, have some extended community, don't stare at phones all day, don't outsource parenting, okay, blah, blah, blah. We all do it though. I mean, that seems to be the disconnect.
That's right. Actually, and here's the piece that I think we were missing. The mental health professionals have been participating in the problem. Okay? So why did parents give up their authority? Because they outsourced it to mental health experts. They became so convinced that they could traumatize a child if they ever smacked their hand or yelled at them, that they could cause trauma. They said, you know what, we're not expert here. We don't really know how to raise our kids. Let's bring in a mental health professional and maybe they can explain what's wrong with my child. And we did that again and again. I think that mental health experts were absolutely a major source of the suffering of the kids we're seeing.
Okay, so I definitely want to hit on that because that I thought was one of like the really great points of the book. But you mentioned this thing about teen boys in liberal families. And it's interesting because you said there's sort of like a social contagion there. Your previous book, Irreversible Damage, was about the social contagion as it relates to gender confusion, but you were mostly talking about teen girls, or I guess even prepubescent girls, who then thought they were boys. So there's some strange connection there, right?
I think so. I think what we're seeing is a lot of social contagion. Some of it coming through social media, some of it just peer-to-peer, and some of it coming from the mental health professionals that march in the door and try to teach every kid that they are disordered, that they never say they're shy anymore. They say they have social phobia. They don't say they're afraid. They say they have anxiety. They never say they're sad. They say they're depressed. They never say they're hyperactive or inattentive or bored in school. They have ADHD. Where did they get the idea that they were all disordered? And the thing about these mental health diagnoses, if you say you're shy, you can say to someone, well, look, you're shy. Get out there, make new friends. I know it's hard, but do it. But if you have a mental health diagnosis, it's much harder to fix yourself. Certainly you can't without a professional or a medication. It's a limiting thing for a child to hear. And unfortunately, they're buying into these limitations. And it's why for the first time we're seeing, 86% of Gen Z says they have menu anxiety. They have trouble ordering in a restaurant from a menu by themselves. We've convinced a whole generation that there's something mentally really wrong with them. And so it's playing out.
How much do you think COVID and the lockdowns and the years lost there and the speech delays and the litany of other things that we now know have happened is playing into all of this?
The lockdowns were terrible for mental health. We know that. We knew it. But you knew this. I knew this. Guess who didn't know it? The mental health experts did not issue not one of their organizations issued a single warning as our schools went into a second year of lockdowns. The APA did show up to Congress to protest police tactics, the affirmative action ruling from the Supreme Court. They have gone to warn Congress about climate anxiety and climate change and the danger of that to mental health. But somehow these so-called professionals completely failed to give any warning, as in 2020, in the fall of 2020, we headed into a second year of lockdowns. If that doesn't tell you everything you need to know, it should at least make you wonder.
How much of this do you think is coming from the parent? You know, it's interesting because you mentioned the liberal parents of young boys. I suspect that the liberal parents of young girls are still also involved in the social contagion part from your previous book more. But how much of it is just parents that have sort of accepted all of the wrong ideas? Like when you mention climate anxiety and that sort of thing, no kid actually believes that or has that. They've been infected by that. You know, AOC saying we have 12 years to live. That was 4 years ago, so the clock's a-ticking.
That's exactly right. And it's a great statistic. It's not mine. It's from Jean Twenge. There was no, she's a liberal researcher. There's no agenda behind the finding. But what it shows is that the crisis, the so-called mental health crisis, is not organic. These aren't kids with schizophrenia by and large, although, we have that problem. And they're not kids with bipolar disorder. These are bummed out kids because of the unhealthy childhood we've given them. And one of the things we've done, as you mentioned, is pass on our anxiety to our kids. We know anxiety is highly contagious, and we're passing on our worries to our kids, just as you said.
Did you ever see the video, it's gone viral, a couple different versions of it, where it's Jordan Peterson talking about the proper way to parent and that what you really want to do is send your kid out to the playground or the backyard or whatever it is until they are exhausted. So at the end of the day, they have dinner and then they go to bed. And that so many of the problems are we're keeping them cooped up, they're watching TV all day, or they're on their iPad or whatever else, and then their bodies are wigging out. Like they have an energetic, innate need to move, and perhaps that is a lot of it too. So it's not just the wrong ideas, it's what that's doing to them physically by not getting out some of the proper stuff.
There's no question. And I talk about in the book surveillance parenting. We became surveillance. It isn't just that kids need, as Dr. Peterson said, look, we do need, running around, but they also need that independence, taking risks, doing things that are a little dangerous without an adult to give them warning. Look, in my kids' school, we have recess monitors. We have bus monitors. There are adults who are there to warn you if the monkey bars are slick with rain. You never get the consequence of your, own judgment. And what's interesting? See, I learned this when I was researching the book. In Japan, and these are kids they're raising much healthier kids in Japan in terms of anxiety and depression. They actually prize independence in kids like they do in Israel. And they actually create in their preschools in Japan areas that adults can't see. They have rocks, they have boulders, they have streams. They don't want kids to have an adult run up to them every time they scrape a knee, because they want kids who can pick themselves up after they scrape a knee and realize they're going to live.
You haven't visited us here in Miami yet, but I think you'd be very proud at how we're parenting, because we kind of let them do their thing and let them explore, and they can fall a little bit and their knees are getting nicked up already. And we're trying to balance that. And it's a constant balancing act, but you have to do it. I will give you some credit because I've met your three beautiful kids a couple times now, and I've never seen an iPad or a phone at the table. So you're not just preaching this stuff, you're actually putting it into action. Where do you think the mental health community, is there a moment in time that they went off the rails, or is this just an extension of like, oh, well, we dole drugs out to people and we need patients that show up every week. So yes, of course, we're going to look to scale regardless of the damage it's doing to society.
Well, that's a great question. There are essentially two so-called mental health crises going on at the same time. There's the very real crisis of schizophrenics on our street, of bipolar patients. These are people suffering greatly, who are undertreated and undercared for. And we don't want to give them the resources because it's really, really hard to help them. It's much easier to do what we're doing now. look at them and say, wow, lots of people are suffering, and then throw preventive mental health resources. And ever since the Second World War, we've done this. Soldiers came home. Some of them were really emotionally shaky. Some had PTSD. And we thought, you know what we need? Preventive mental health care. We're going to start treating the well. And since that time, the APA membership in the American Psychology Association from 1946 to I think in the 1980s has quadrupled twice. And we started shifting our focus to seeing what psychologists or mental health experts could do with already healthy kids. Maybe they could improve them a little. And that's when they introduced problems. They actually made well kids sick. And by giving them unnecessary treatments. You know, people ask me, are you against therapy? And I say, I'm no more against psychotherapy than I am against chemotherapy. But chemotherapy for people who need it, people with cancer, you don't give it to someone who's well.
It's interesting because after writing this book, were you able to sort of figure out, well, is it the talk therapy and the behavioral therapy that's worse? Or is it the psychotropic drugs and the overindulgence of every behavior, we're just going to numb it industry?
Both of them are bad, and there's a lot of research to show that, first of all, the most important thing with the psychotherapy is people don't even know it carries risks. So actual researchers know this. There's a tremendous body of research actually showing that, for instance, people who went to grief therapy after normal bereavement, so, you know, the loss of a loved one, ended up worse off, more depressed than those who didn't go to therapy. Burn victims, first responders. There have been all kinds of situations, the DARE campaign in schools, in which the idea behind the campaign was to make people better, but actually what they had gone through was fairly normal. People are fairly resilient. On average, they're overwhelmingly resilient. And these psychological interventions actually made those people feel worse about their condition. Or in the case of the DARE campaign, you remember that DARE to say no to drugs?
Oh yeah.
That introduced more drug use. We now know that there have been many studies on this, and kids were more likely to be interested in drugs after the program.
So was the reasoning for that because they basically put it into every school, so kids who were not thinking, I mean, that's sort of what I remember. Do you know the years of DARE off the top of your head by chance?
The 1980s and 1990s.
Yeah, so that's when, you know, you and I were elementary school, middle school. And I do remember, I had no knowledge of drugs in 6th or 7th grade. And then next thing you know, they brought in some guy, and it was under the DARE thing. I remember it vividly in the gym. And he's talking about smoking crack. And we thought it was hilarious. But then we knew about crack, I guess.
And also, there are many theories as to why.
It sounds crazy to think back now. Yeah.
I mean, it is, but it was a total failure. We know it was a total failure. It followed the techniques of a very famous psychologist. And the idea was to go into schools and just get kids to open up about drug use. And somehow that encouraged drug use. We don't know if it's because it hadn't occurred to them or they felt like afterwards it was widespread. Some people think they went home and had conversation with the parents, and parents opened up to them about their drug use, and that encouraged it. But for whatever reason, all this discussion in a population that overwhelmingly hadn't yet tried drugs encouraged it. And we're doing the same thing with distress, with anxiety and depression. We're marching into schools and we're telling everybody about suicide all the time. We're telling everyone about depression and anxiety all the time. The mental health staff of schools are doing this. And lo and behold, we have a generation over half, 60% of them does not believe their mental health is good.
Did you find there are any prescriptions to defeat the prescriptions? I mean, I suppose family and some of the things you referenced right up top, but I mean systemically when it comes to all of the institutions that are pushing all of this stuff, the schools that are pushing all of this stuff, the pharmaceutical companies that are pushing all this stuff, it's almost, in some ways, it's too big to defeat in a bizarre sense.
It is. We need less of it. We need to shrink it. So if we shrink mental health staffs in schools, then the school counselors will be forced to deal with the kids who actually have problems. Right now, they have the resources and they're increasing. They're presenting themselves as the solution. So they're talking to every kid about their trauma. And that's what the problem is. It isn't that drugs are never appropriate. It's that we're showering them. Do you know teachers are the #1 source of referral for ADHD medication? Now, that tells you a lot. teachers are sort of conflicted, right? Because if they want a child bolted to their seat. Now, I've talked to parents who say 1 year my teacher told me my kid had ADHD. The next year they said he was a great student. And no one says,
Well-
to be honest, I'm not a very good teacher.
Right. Or back in our day, it's like you had a kid in your class who was a little kind of nutty, and they dealt with him as they had to deal with him, but you weren't drugging everybody. I mean,
No.
that's the fundamental. But what do you do in a time when these institutions have become so politicized, they've all gone so woke? You're not going to get someone from the teachers union to come in and be like, all right, we're firing the half of the mental health experts because they believe that stuff.
Right. I mean, you have to start with the idea that parents know best. First of all, parents need to remember that they know a lot more